but your diaphragm is also a dial between your stress states and your relaxation states. And if breath is left unchecked, anxiety can keep spiraling and replicating itself, but we can adjust the way we're breathing. We can also adjust via pressure and posture, some other components of breathing, and we can really flip our stress switch. I call it turning on your off switch, and be able to tackle some of the runaway mental health issues.
Hey, my guest today on the Freedom Pack podcast is the author of Body by Breath, Jill Miller. Jill, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lewis. It's great to be here.
Well, I first discovered this book just because I felt like everywhere I turned in the personal development space on my social media, I was seeing this book pop up over and over again. Mutual friends of the show. I think I saw it on Andy Galpin's page. And then on my personal social media, I was seeing, people I'm a big fan of, Jenna Fisher, Mayim Bialik, all posting about this book. I thought I need to see what it's all about. And the reception to the book seems to have gone extremely well. And this is a subject for me that I'm certainly no expert in. I'm very interested in it. I've done podcasts on breath before with James Nestor and Samuel Whiting and people like that. But certainly a topic that doesn't come easy to me, so I'm going to approach this conversation as just a curious mind.
Well, that's really what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that curious minds, actually curious bodies, come to this book, because breath is a thing that doesn't just belong as a nose to lungs experiment, and it's really not something to think about, but it's something to experience through every system of your body. And that's what this book is really a travelogue for that, for you. And I wrote this book also because I'm the offspring of somebody who lives with chronic asthma. My mother still has chronic asthma to this day, and both of my grandmothers passed from COPD. These are lung-related diseases, and so it was really important for me to be able to share my research and my application approach for so many bodies living in peril. But also under compromise, and things that are very easy to adjust with pressure, with massage, with autonomic nervous system adjustments, and so on. So I'm glad that you were moved by seeing some of these other friends of mine and even advisors championing the book. Yeah, wonderful.
Well, you touched on it a little bit there, so I want to jump to this question. The foreword of the book really struck a chord with me because when I was a young child, I used to watch my brother having asthma attacks, and it used to really, really scare me. And I think is it Lewis Jackson who wrote the foreword to the book, and I found his sort of story really powerful. He says that he hasn't eliminated his asthma, but thanks to you, he's overrun it. What powerful stories or journeys or sort of case studies have you taken that can show these guys a sort of first-hand look at what work like yours can contribute to, that can really inspire people?
Wow. Yeah, Lewis's story gives me the goosebumps every time I think about it, because here he was actually he was a singer, and he was a poet and a Stanford grad, and in the yoga industry, he was a yoga teacher, and still suffering from asthma. And he had never been told where his respiratory diaphragm was in his body. And he didn't know that he could do direct manipulations to impact it and his lung health and this passage of breath from nose to lungs and throughout the body. He took a workshop from me. Oh, I'm sure this was like 14 years ago. I mean, it's in the book, but and that was the first time in his early 40s that the asthmatic kid ever contacted his respiratory diaphragm. And I hear this story again and again. I was actually working with, this is another story related to Body by Breath. One of the reasons why Kelly Starrett, who is the founder of the Ready State, was so attracted to my work is because I helped him recognize the missing pieces of his own asthma that he wasn't addressing via self-myofascial release or specific mobilizations that could help with the musculature that rigidifies to protect a body from these asthma attacks, or it's the type of rigidity that comes about from having repeated asthma attacks. So Kelly brought me onto a program that he had years ago. This was on a platform called Creative Live. I think this was maybe 12 years ago, and he brought me on to spend a session talking to his viewers about breath. And then another session I spent and I did fascia explanation and fascia processed work with his people. And this was really the first time that I had a platform that big, because I think there were like hundreds of thousands of people watching this live stream. And I taught everybody who was watching, in the room, but also people at home, how to actually palpate their diaphragm, which is really easy. All you do is kind of lean forward and you take your fingers and you move them around the ridge of your lower ribs. And you can even do this right now while I'm talking to you, Lewis. I'm doing it right now as well. But the fingers can curl underneath the ribs. Yeah. And then you can piano finger into the substance, the softness that you're touching. Really what you're touching, of course, is your skin, you're touching your superficial fascia, your fatty layer, you're touching your transversus abdominis, some of the obliques, but deep to that is the respiratory diaphragm living in this cove of bones in the lower rib cage. And so if your fingers are underneath there and then you take a breath in, and you take a breath in a way that expands your abdomen, you'll actually feel the diaphragm descending into your fingers. So I taught this process on this program at Creative Live, and I come off the stage and I check my phone messages, because there were a number of phone messages, and one of them was from my mother. My mother at the time was probably 65 years old, and she left me this message like, "Oh my God, I just watched you. I just touched my diaphragm for the first time in my life." And so here's my 65-year-old asthmatic mother who's been rushed to the hospital, again and again throughout my childhood. Same thing, she had been given chemical medicine, inhalers, prednisone, all types of long-term damaging medications, but had never familiarized herself with the actual structures that conduct respiration in her body. And so that really is a part of why this book needed to be written, was to really help people familiarize themselves with the global impact, the ripple effect of the motion of the lining of your body. The prime movement of your body is respiration. We could argue whether it's the heart. We can argue that. But I'm going to say it's your diaphragm is the most important muscle of your body. And this sort of blast radius that the diaphragm has throughout every system of your body.
Yeah, well, I think that for a lot of people, this stuff is, I think it's starting to make its way into the mainstream now. Thanks to a lot of work of guys like Andrew Huberman, who've really been pushing these on major platforms now. But for myself, and I know for a lot of other people who are listening to this podcast, a lot of this stuff is going to be brand new to them. The idea of breath having such an impact on their body and their health, and it reminded me of a quote at the start of your book. I can't remember whose quote it was, but it says, "Some doors only open from the inside. Breath is a way of accessing that door." And it made me think, what would you say to those people who may be listening to this podcast right now? They're 5 minutes in, they're deciding whether it's for them. They're thinking, is this for me? Can something as simple as breath actually impact my health? Is this worth my time? For me, I think you summed it up perfectly in your book. You said a person could survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, but probably not 3 minutes without breath. When I read that, I thought, yeah, why wouldn't we pay more attention to this?
Yeah, I mean, your breath is happening 22,000 times a day, whether you're paying attention to it or not. Yeah. And that's really the beauty of breathing. Your brain has decided, I got this. You don't have to think about it at all. And you really don't think about it until you're short of breath. until you start to feel strangled by breath. And then it becomes really problematic. I mean, the last 3 years have really brought lung health and breath health to the forefront. I mean, first of all, I owe incredible debt of gratitude to James Nestor for kicking the door open to mass consciousness around why breathing is so important, why breath is so important. I mean, I started writing this book 18 years ago. I was been under contract for 8 years. So when I started formally writing this book, breath was not trending, and I had a number of different obstacles that prevented me from finishing the book in a timely manner. I was supposed to finish it in a year, and of course, here we are 8 years later. But I really owe a debt of gratitude to James for being able to tell the story of breath in a way that was extremely compelling. And then there's applicators like me who can come in, provide additional science, additional context, and also application for helping people to realize that, if breath is this underlying layer, it's this underlining of posture. It is, people don't even realize it's an overlord of digestion. The movement of your diaphragm is bouncing your organs all day long. And if your diaphragm is not moving well, that does impact motility. But your diaphragm is also a dial between your stress states and your relaxation states. And if breath is left unchecked, anxiety can keep spiraling and replicating itself. But we can adjust the way we're breathing. We can also adjust via pressure and posture, some other components of breathing, and we can really flip our stress switch. I call it turning on your off switch, and be able to tackle some of the runaway mental health issues that have just exploded in the last 3 years. And what I really want to trying to point to is the pandemic has brought lung health to the forefront, but it's also excited a tremendous amount of anxiety-related diseases and disorders. And all the global indices of health right now are pointing to long COVID and anxiety-related diseases as the #1 global health issues to watch. And that's why the book is coming out at such a good time, because this really does give people a way to handle those stresses within their structure and the stresses of the internal global effects of mental health and anxiety, because mental health doesn't live in your head either. It's a body-wide phenomenon. And so, the applications in this book and also the science that I bring about in the book, and actually some of the quotes in the book are from Andrew, who I'm lucky I got to teach with him mid-pandemic and share some of this work with him as well. So it really is an exciting time to be able to bring the science alive, but to bring it through people's bodies and give them something that doesn't have negative side effects. So, I mean, I'm not against medication. I've been on different prescriptions at different points in my life, but for a long-term, no negative side effect impact, there really is a lot that we can do. And, breath is one of those tools. The book outlines really a compound pharmacy of things that you can do. Breath is one of the tools, rolling via self-myofascial release, movement, and then something called non-sleep deep rest or yoga nidra. These are really 4 tools that are incredible for accessing deep relaxation, parasympathetic healing states.
Well, as you said there, this wasn't really a topic that was at the forefront when you started writing this book, and it's certainly a topic that is of growing concern, especially in the personal development space. And you mentioned there James Nestor, and when I've had guests on like James Nestor or Patrick McEwen to talk about breath, we seem to get a lot more questions in the comments. People seem a lot more interested, because to a lot of people, like we said, this is a topic that's brand new for them. And so I'd like to just stay in on this topic of, letting people know why they should care. What sort of benefits are we talking about here when we become conscious of our breath? Because I think a lot of people, they may already come in with the idea of, recovery, better sleep, but you even suggest, performance-based changes like cognitive function.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that has to do with the adjustments in terms of the sympathetic, parasympathetic resilience balance of our autonomic nervous system. I mean, if we are always running at 0 to 60 and burning our candle, you have to figure out a way to restore and replenish. And that restore and replenish doesn't take place when you're in fight or flight all the time. So it's most bodies, especially those who are, achievement-based and success-based, it's that 0 to 60 and the grind is like, yeah, that's my sweet spot. But to go from 60 to 0 without crashing, falling apart, or having a breakdown is not so easy. I mean, in fact, stillness is very challenging for a lot of bodies, especially if they are high achievers. And I'm not saying that stillness is the remedy, because for some people, when they are still, that's when the pain surfaces, or that's when the bad emotional feelings surface, or that's when they really literally can't get their brain to stop whirling about. And so there has to be a way to create a different cascade into the relaxation response to allow for creative thinking to occur, to actually allow for emotions to surface, because also those suppressed emotions, the ones that we're running from all the time, eventually those become kinks in the road that can create true mental blocks and an inability to push beyond a problem or see creative ways forward. So there's so many ways to address your question. But in terms of the high performers that are, body-focused performers, if you think about just anatomically, if you think about the location of the respiratory diaphragm and its interconnections to the variety of muscles that it ties to, once you recognize, and that's why I start the book with a lot of anatomy, I make it really fun. My apologies to those of you who, don't like looking at at muscle anatomy and neuroanatomy, but it's really worth the trip, because the respiratory diaphragm, it is within the same fascial envelope as the transversus abdominis. And the transversus abdominis, for those of you who don't know, is your deepest, quote unquote, abdominal layer. And those who are trying to get ripped abs, shred them all the time, like to keep looking thin by pulling the abs in.
Yeah.
What you may not know is the lack of elasticity in your abdominals is impacting your diaphragm's ability to descend on inhale and then to easily float back up on exhale. There's a reciprocal elastic relationship between the diaphragm and the musculature below it. And it's not just the transversus. This is, the diaphragm is fascially connected to a muscle called the quadratus lumborum, which is a deep low back muscle, connects to the back of your pelvis, and to the psoas. And the psoas connects all the way down to the top of the femur and across your lumbar spine. So the fascial and connective tissue relationships of the diaphragm to your performance core are indisputable. And so you'd want to have a better elastic relationship, and also a better relationship of sensing these tissues so that you can selectively activate them better at will for whatever task you're exerting upon. So I think there's a big sell on getting to know your breath from this cognitive emotional perspective, but I think there's also a really big sell on getting to know and mapping the range of your respiration, because of how it is so performance enhancing for muscle function. But also it when we get to know the diaphragm, especially in the ways that I direct people throughout the book, you start to somehow eradicate aches and pains, or just this unknown friction that was going on in your SI joint or your low back, or this little thing in your neck. They literally disappear because of the way this work decompresses the axis, which is your body basically from pelvis to skull.
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed most about this book is that, unlike a lot of books that you may find on subjects like this, it's not all just throwing information at you and expecting you to understand everything. It's very accessible, and there are a lot of there's a lot of practicality in your book that almost sort of takes the reader on a journey from the start to the end. And one of them was the sort of the breaths per minute baseline. When you teach people the breaths per minute baseline. I was just wondering if you could expand on what we can use this as an indicator for. If we look at the chart and we see we're above or below the normal range of our age for breaths per minute, what could that tell us?
So this breath baseline is there's a number of different self-assessments throughout the book. And this one comes up right away at the beginning. And it's just to familiarize yourself with what are the number of breaths my body has taken in a minute. And so according to the medical literature, the average person has a 12 to 20 breath at rest baseline. Yeah. So that's you just sitting, hoping that your breath becomes unself-conscious. Because first of all, when you start to stare at your breath, sometimes your brain is like, wait a minute, I got this, I can do this. And all of a sudden, as you become aware of your breath, there literally is a little bit of anxiety or camera shyness about the breathing. And so that in and of itself, just becoming aware that your breath doesn't want to be gazed upon is something to work with. Yeah. It's really interesting to try to bear witness to breathing and realize that your breath won't allow you to let it just be. And that actually is kind of an avatar for other controlness that we have in the rest of our life. You just want your breath to be in the wild in your body, and you be like a scientist, observing something happening in the wild. So it's a very subjective, objective, interesting thing. So if you can sort of sidestep your own self-awareness of being aware that you are breathing, and allow your breath to come and go, the average is 12 to 20. However, this was really interesting. So WHOOP was collecting data during the early pandemic. And one of my friends, Belisa Vranich, who's also a breath expert and just works in the medical space around breathing and also worked with high performance athletes, she shared some data from a blog that was on the WHOOP website. They had noticed their user data that the breaths per minute baseline was now 15 to 22 breaths per minute. So just to contextualize this for you, the faster you're breathing on average, the more you're in your sympathetic fight or flight or fright state of being. So to know that the baseline was no longer 12 at the bottom, and by the way, my breath per baseline, I'm usually like 8 to 10 because I have very low blood pressure. I do a lot of these practices. Even though I am a high anxiety person, my breath per baseline, because my body has become very efficient, is lower than the average, right? And so there, people are all over in terms of what their baseline is. But you think about the ramping up of a sample of population, these are WHOOP users too. So these are probably people who are into personal development and they're into fitness. But the pandemic spared no one in terms of the rising tide of vigilance and fear. No matter where you stood on any issues, there were restrictions in place that were really adjusting the anxiety baseline throughout the planet. And so I just find this very, very interesting to see that reflection. But ultimately, to do a restorative practice, the evidence says if you can do a 5 to 8 breaths per minute type of practice, you're going to really amplify parasympathetic measures. So I think like as a general scope, you're not going to have 5 to 8 breaths like at your baseline typically. You're going to be around the 10-ish mark. Let's just be honest about it. That's just with breath going unchecked as you're sitting without exercising. Like there's nothing stimulating you, as if that can happen. Even your own mind not stimulating you. Do you understand what I'm saying, Louis? Yeah. So it's very hard to get an objective measure of that. But if you're trying to adjust the thermostat on your stress state, 5 to 8 is that sweet spot typically.
I talked there about the practicality in the book. Now, there may be a lot of people out there that don't really want or don't have the ability to dedicate the time to sort of specific breathing practices. But in the book, you talk about, or you give examples of everyday ways and adjustments you can make to just breathe better in a sense, posture, things like that. I imagine, posture plays a big part of that. What ways would you suggest that we can alter our everyday habits to contribute to better breath without maybe having to dedicate 10 minutes a day to certain, practices and techniques?
So The book is called Body by Breath, but I mentioned earlier, there are multiple tools that are used to help induce different shifts, not only in your breath, but also in your posture, digestion, mood. And those tools are obviously breathe is one, roll is another, move is another, and non-sleep deep rest or yoga nidra. So I really like to use palpation and pressure as a way to manipulate the body, to really essentially trick it into different ways of breathing and to different ways of being. And so, my first book was called The Role Model. I specialize in self-myofascial release. So I use tools to help people do that. For example, one of the tools that I use for the breathing specifically is this squishy ball. It's called the Coregeous ball. But if you don't have a soft, pliable, like air-filled ball like this, you can roll up a yoga mat or an exercise mat. And what you would do is place it against your rib cage to start. You can just lay on your side in your bed and stuff your pillow or a rolled up towel to create pressure into the ribs, and then start to practice breathing into them, just to get your breath into a different perception of itself. So as your ribs move against the object and then your ribs are tucked back in on exhale, you're going to really start to feel the behavior of what I call in the book zone 2 breathing. So zone 2 breathing is breathing that coordinates muscles called the intercostals along with the diaphragm. And just starting to feel the range that breath attends to within your structure, that new awareness has such a great carryover, because after you that side, then you do the other side and you start to feel, oh, well, what does this side do when I breathe? Then you sit back up and all of a sudden you have this awareness that, oh my goodness, my back is breathing too. My low back is breathing now. And so is my abdomen, my pelvic floor. And I'm actually not feeling like my neck is gripping at my breath. Usually I always have this weird, like, kind of tense thing when I try to take a quote unquote deep breath. For some reason, my jaw and my face or my shoulders hike up, but that's not happening now. All of a sudden, I've been able to get my breath below the high stress zone. So the high stress zone that I outlined in the book is called zone 3. And it's the unfortunate assistance of the shoulders, head and neck that love to kind of grab at breath, especially in super high stress states. But just to have the tactile experience of, where is my breath's home? Where does breath move in my body? And that it's not just this nose to lungs pathway, but that there is a soft tissue ripple effect into so many other places. So I don't just leave the breath alone. I manipulate the heck out of it in really fun ways. And those manipulations are not just pressing on bones, they're not just pressing on muscles, they're creating friction in different fascial layers, and they're arousing different sensory neurons, different, really the parts of your brain that are reaching and peppering into different layers of tissues. So we're getting all sorts of shifts in our cognition and our emotional perception, and then also just our sense perception of our body and being.
Now, I don't want to give too much of the book away or sort of dilute its content down at all, because I encourage anyone to, any of these concepts we're talking about today, please go and read about them in more detail. But I wondered if you could explain to our audience your recipe for conscious relaxation.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's really simple. There's 5 P's to create a parasympathetic state in your body. What is a parasympathetic state? That is the deep well of relaxation where we restore, regenerate, replenish, and feel. We get to feel our feels there. So there are 5 different things, and they're all start with P, so it's easy to memorize them. But the first P is perspective. And perspective has to do with a mindset. So when you're trying to chill out, sometimes the hardest thing is to, like, when someone says, just relax, it's really not easy. But if you give yourself an action step there, like, for example, one that's very helpful with anxiety, if you're like, oh my God, I'm highly anxious and I need to chill, I need to relax, a statement like, all of me is welcome here. All of me is welcome here, so that you're not dismissing or discounting the anxiety body that's showing up. You're not just going to squash him or shame him, you're like, you know what, you're welcome here too, buddy. All of me is welcome here. Or one that I really like, and I've been using on the road when I'm teaching master classes for the book, is my breath is home. My breath is home. Another, I'm a safe space. I am a safe space. So there's lots of different ways that you can work this so that you have a top-down experience. Because when you go into deep parasympathetic states, your body is going to have extremely bizarre experiences. And sometimes it's hard to contextualize them. And a lot of those experiences can be emotions. It can be the way your body starts to talk to you, like literally voices from inside your gut that have never spoken to you before. Or your physical body might do very strange things. You might start to have an erotic experience. You might start to laugh uncontrollably. You might have a spasm in a soft tissue here or there. So having a top down allows for whatever to occur to be welcome, because those are the things that are probably been submerged by living in this sympathetic state in a chronic way. So perspective.
Yeah.
The second P is place. Ideally, if you're looking for a parasympathetic experience, your brain really likes dark, warm, and quiet. So you're looking for a safe space that's very peaceful. Yes. And so this really does also help the vagus nerve to come online. So the vagus nerve is your chief parasympathetic nerve. And so that's what we're trying to do here, is adjust sympathetic stimuli so that our parasympathetic nervous system can spark up and take over so that we can relax. So we have our perspective, we have our place. The third thing is position. Position very much has to do with getting your postural muscles to let go. And so getting on the ground helps. Reclining helps. Or better yet, if you can recline and then prop your pelvis a little bit high, so you go into what's called gentle slope position in the book. And the gentle slope position is where your pelvis slightly higher than your heart, slightly higher than your head. So you basically create a very gentle cascade. And what this does for your relaxation response is your blood is going to respond to that shift in gravity. So your blood is, subject to the laws of gravity, just like all of your other body parts. And when you're in that upside down-ish position, too much blood starts to rush towards your brain. And you have very, very strict guidelines about your blood-brain barrier. And the gatekeepers for that are nestled within the carotid arteries on either side of your neck. And those carotid arteries are peppered with stretch sensors that are part of the vagus nerve. And so when those stretch sensors sense that too much blood is coming this way, there's a very quick relay, and the vagus nerve tells your heart rate to slow down, it tells your breath pace to slow down, and it starts to constrict all of the vasculature throughout your body so that it limits blood flow to the brain. And so that's a freebie. And it sounds kind of horrific at first. You're like, oh my God, it's going to slow down my heart, it's going to constrict my blood. No, this is a good thing, because actually you just got relaxed for free by gravity. So we've got perspective, place, position. The fourth P is pace of breath. You've been waiting for the breath thing. How does breath help? Our fourth P is pace of breath. The pace of breath typically to induce the relaxation response is longer exhales compared to the duration of inhale. So in sort of a gross outline, just whatever you're breathing in, breathe out longer. Yeah. Whatever you're breathing in, breathe out longer. And there are paradoxical breathing patterns where the inhale can actually induce a relaxation response, but read about that in the book. But big picture, exhales longer than inhales. And then the fifth P, Lewis, is palpation. Palpation has to do with self-massage. It has to do with using pressure. That's another P, to alter the stress state within the autonomic nervous system. And additionally, there are specific places that you can massage that are mechanostimulating your vagus nerve, again, which will excite the vagus. And when the vagus gets excited, you chill out. Yeah. So those are the 5 Ps for a parasympathetic dominant state.
I love this. So we've got perspective, place, position, pace of breath, palpation. this is what I've been talking about. I love this sort of practicality that you have in your work. It, you know, is so accessible to the reader. And on that topic, if I were to ask you right now to maybe issue a challenge or one exercise for our audience today to come away from this podcast when they have, you know, 5 minutes later on, one sort of challenge or exercise for them to try, what would you issue them?
Well, I would give you an exercise that compounds all those 5 Ps. So you literally have a compound pharmacy that will induce the relaxation response. So the exercise is you're going to take gentle slope position. So you get down on the ground, and then you would lift your pelvis up on an object. I like to put it on the Courgeous ball because then the sacrum, the pelvis, actually gets traction on the ball. But if you don't have a ball, you can put your pelvis up on a couple of books or on a yoga block if that's something that you have at the house. So make sure that's just a few inches in height. And then once you're reclined, and by the way, before you reclined, you would probably say something to yourself like, I allow myself to relax completely, or relaxation completes me. Maybe that's a good one. Relaxation completes me. So you're down on the ground, you're lifting your pelvis up, you've self-suggested relaxation completes me. And then you'll place a couple of smaller balls. So hopefully you have some self-myofascial release balls at home. If you don't have, like I obviously have balls because that's my part of my business. I have yoga tune-up balls that are soft, squishy, and grippy. You can use tennis balls. You know, use something that has give. Lacrosse balls are very hard, so find something that has give. And then you would place one ball on either side of your neck on your upper trapezius. The upper trapezius tends to be one of those areas everybody wants a back rub on, and it's actually innervated by a nerve called the accessory nerve. And by the way, the accessory nerve shares source nuclei. It shares its origin in the brainstem with the vagus. And so massaging this gives us a really additional good bonus for our vagus nerve and our parasympathetic dominant state. So your pelvis is up, my relaxation completes me. You're laying on top of these therapy balls, and then you'll start to take a breath that fills your gut, fills your ribs, and as you exhale, you'll start to squirm and move. So we get we get a little bit of movement in there, and you'll decorate your upper trapezius with the therapy balls as you're breathing. And of course, you're going to try to extend your exhalations longer than your inhale. And that would be a really great, you know, handful of minutes type of practice. And so we've also, we're in a good place, and our position is on the ground in that gentle slope. So we have all 5 Ps illuminated in one simple exercise that when you come out of that, you will feel different. So give yourself time under, not time under tension, but time under intention there. You know, set a timer for 3 to 4 minutes and come off of that. Don't pop up right away. Let yourself reflect on that relaxation completes me. Take a moment to really soak that up. Feel the shift in your body, and then move into your next thing.
Oh, amazing. I really thank you for the practicality, and I think everyone knows what I'm going to be doing with the rest of my evening now. So as we start to wind down, you mentioned earlier that 8 years ago when you started writing this book that, you know, the topic of breath wasn't really out there like it is today. Where do you see this topic, this subject, 8 years from now?
During the early pandemic, so my father is an infectious disease doctor, and he's been on the front lines in the ICU down in San Diego where he works. And I remember him calling me early in the pandemic and just saying, Jill, people need this work. Keep doing what you're doing. Finish that book. I don't see any end in sight for the perils of lung challenges in people's bodies. I mean, if my mother and grandmothers had this work decades ago, maybe they could have prevented their early deaths. My mother's still alive. I mean, she pretends to do this work. She's charmed me by showing up in workshops, but she doesn't do it unless I'm right there staring at her. So I just don't see an end for the growth in general population about this topic. And it's something that this was the first book I wanted to write when Victory Belt approached me 12 years ago to write a book for them. I chose to write the role model, this book on self-myofascial release, because I knew that that was trending. I knew breath wasn't trending back then. Although for me, it had always been the most important thing. And so, trends take a long time to take foot. And, I can roll with the punches. I understand culture and I understand how things change and grow and shift. And luckily, my work encompasses the whole body. And so I have lots of work ahead of me. And, the diaphragm and respiration tie into literally every system of the body. So I just don't see any end for it.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to more and more of your work. We mentioned we've dipped into body by breath today. There's obviously a lot more detail these guys can discover by checking out the book. Where is the best place to direct everyone listening now where they can check out and buy the book?
Well, depending on where you're listening from, I was very excited to be talking to England today. I'm talking to you from England, right?
Well, the UK, yeah. I'm actually from Wales, but we're right next door to England, but yeah.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Okay,
Britain is
all
the
right.
same. The UK, yeah.
Okay, forgive me. Yes, so it is on amazon.co.uk for the
Yeah.
UK listeners. International listeners, you can find it on Book Depository, or you can find it on your local, potentially your local Amazon outlet. Ask independent bookstores to carry it, please. Libraries. I know that there's a library in Canada that ordered 25 copies. So it is available worldwide. Of course, it's also available digitally. I can't recommend it digitally because I don't have the digital copy. It is a hard copy book. I'm holding mine up right now for anybody who's watching on video to see, but the illustrations are always better in person on the page. So I'd highly recommend getting this book, as it really is a manual / textbook that has years of practices for you ahead. So yeah, it's available worldwide, anywhere you can buy books. And then you can find me online. My website is tuneupfitness.com. And we have about 500 teachers worldwide that teach my work, both the body by breath work, yoga tune-up, and role model work. And then I do have an online classroom. So if you're excited by anything you've heard today and you're like, I want to try stuff out right away with Jill, every week there's a new class, and there's about 250 classes that live in the class library, very well produced. There's also trainings, longer form courses with partners like Kelly Starrett, like Tom Myers of Anatomy Trains, Katy Bowman of Nutritious Movement. We all have collaborations programs together. And I have a new program coming out in May with a friend, Doc Jen Fabroni, that's called Roll into HIT, that uses HIT as the mechanism of exercise training, and we deconstruct it. We practice it, we also deconstruct it with self-myofascial release, breath work, and it's very, very exciting.
Well, I will make sure all the links to the book, your projects, and your social media are in the description below. Jill, thank you so much again for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lewis. It's really a treasure.